Hello, and thank you for joining me on another episode of the Tech Exec podcast. As always, I'm your host, Aviv Ben-Yosef, and we're here to help you triple impact per engineer and create a team worth leading. Our subject today is theory. And if you've been listening for a while, every once in a while I borrow an idea from one of my hobbies, and this time it's going to be from chess. If you're a chess newbie like myself, you probably end up watching too many YouTube videos of people explaining different games, tactics, strategies, ideas. And as these games begin, what most of these grandmasters tend to do is rush through the first 5, 6, 7, 10, whatever moves and just brush them away, saying casually, this is all theory. When they do that, what they mean is there's no reason to talk about these first 10 moves or whatever because this is known. If you're playing the Sicilian, if you're playing the London system, whatever, this is a known set of moves by you and your opponent. In theory, as in this is solved, this is what we know, this is what one should do. So there's no reason to talk about it, to rehash it in this video. And I'm guessing that when people who actually are good at chess watch this, they just nod along and say, yeah, that's theory, I get that, move on. Let's get to the meaty part of this video. When someone like me watches, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna assume that makes sense because I have no idea, right? What you assume as theory is something that I do not possess. And I wanna talk about the same happening in teams. And there are two levels here that I think are very critical. One is that, isn't it amazing to actually have this sort of agreement of knowledge, just knowing that this is what you're supposed to be doing? And I want to believe that you, dear listener, already have that for many things that you're doing daily. Something happens and you already know how to handle it. It might not be something you're happy about, it might be problematic, and still you know what needs to be done. You have the theory nailed down. You don't have to rethink about it. That's amazing. And I want, first of all, to just note that the fact that you can even get that is something incredibly valuable and indicates so much progress. Sometimes I have clients that I've been working with for a long while. And that means that I get to see for myself the transition that they have been doing, sometimes for over a year. And that means that I can notice things that they maybe got accustomed to. You know, the whole thing about fish not being able to notice the water around them. And for example, they might talk about an issue and just offhandedly remark on, yeah, and I did this and that. And sometimes I would stop them and say, I don't know if you remember, but when the same thing happened for the first time 6 months ago, you weren't so sanguine about it. You actually saw it as a big issue. And the fact that you've transitioned to this automatic mode where you know what needs to be done, shows so much for your growth. So that's level one. And I want you to realize this, because when you realize this, first of all, you can see your own growth, and that's nice. And second, you can start noticing where this happens, because this is where you're accumulating a bunch of very valuable experience. And that's how I want you to progress to level 2 here of your theory. That's about how do we convey and teach this theory so that it is available to everyone in your team, because at the end of the day, as good as a manager you can be, as good as a leader you are, I'm sure that you want, or I hope that you understand, that you cannot be the only one who possesses this theory. Because in your company, as opposed to the leading chess grandmasters in the world, this is not a competition. You actually want to collaborate with them. You're not trying to hide what you know because that's your secret weapon. You're trying to share it, talk about it, so that you all share this common theory. And I don't know if you listening have had a similar experience, but I can say that for myself, there are a few formative things that I learned during my first initial years as an engineer, as a coder, that now I understand really made up that base level of theory for me. that actually is a big part of my operating system as an engineer. For example, I remember one of the very first books I picked up was Design Patterns, and all of a sudden I could talk about something so quickly. I had names for things, so I could just say factory or facade or builder, and that's it. We were there. If you told me you need a proxy, I would understand what that means. That's amazing. That's a theory that we have. The same happened with refactoring. The first time I learned about those names, I learned how to do refactoring before IDEs did that easily for you, and we did that by hand. So we actually had to have this. If you ever saw the original refactoring book, you had this algorithm for how you do that, search and replace by hand. Another great example was the solid principles of code that I felt like how all of these together added up into helping me talk about code faster and have a shared theory with my team. Now, the question is, do you have the same for your team? When I'm working with people, we start and get some of that because we're working together, and some of my terms sometimes gets borrowed into theirs. So again, if you've been listening for a while, you've heard me talk about tech for tech's sake, intermissions, tech capital, how I treat tech debt, what does it mean to move upstream, the problems about glorified managers. If you're one of those who have been listening for the past 4 years that I've been doing this, you and I share a bunch of theory. And the question is, are you doing the same for your team? Are you establishing this theory that's going to help you all be able to handle the day-to-day without it becoming a stressful issue, without it forcing you to stop everything and rethink, without having every single team behave differently? And by creating this, you will create a force multiplier for your entire leadership team. This doesn't stop with leadership, of course. You can have shared theory when it comes to your people. How do you handle outages? How do you handle communication when there's a data breach? I'm hoping that doesn't happen enough for you to get accustomed to it. But it sure does help to have a set routine. You know, in theory, to do. We have an outage and some people can't reach their data for an hour, for example. So what I want you to do is take time right now. And the nice thing about this is that I know that if you're listening on a podcast player, my podcast is most probably the shortest podcast you're subscribed to, because my episodes tend to be 5 to 10 minutes long. And I'm looking at my podcast app. Most of the episodes I've got are like 50 minutes to 3 hours long. And therefore, you owe me a bunch of time. So I want you to take that time. And before moving on to the next episode, don't just let the queue go on. Pause it. If you're driving, if you're doing the dishes, I want you to be with your own thoughts for 3 minutes. That's not a lot. If you're listening to me on 2x, then okay, let's make it somewhere in between. That's 6 minutes. 4.5 is going to be enough. I want you to think about this a bit, and I want you to try and come up with that's it, 2 examples where you can think about areas where you already have theory, but now that you're thinking about this, it wasn't automatic for your people. They had to ask you about this recently. You noticed that they did things not as you would have expected, and this happened recently. Take those 2, commit them to memory, or if you're able to write down right now safely because you're not driving, write it down and do something about it. That's how you get value from listening to this. And before you move on to God knows what on your podcast player, we're going to get some actionable stuff you can do and help you create an amazing team. As I said when we started this episode, this is all about creating a team worth leading. Start with establishing this level of theory, and you're going to have a good time. That's it for this week. Thank you for joining me. As always, do check out my newsletter. I'm just wrapping up a 4-part series about creating dramatically profitable R&D teams and what that means when it comes to your guidelines, to your org structure, to innovation that's profitable, to handling tech debt, etc. So check out my newsletter where you can get all of these every week. Link in the show notes. Thank you. I'll be here next week.